I know what you think. Whatever's trite and vulgar and hard and shallow and cruel, with no mercy or sympathy. That's what you think, and you're proud of it. You good, decent, honest, upright, lawful men who believe in order, when the last man dies, you will have killed him. I've lived with murderers and thugs. There are limits to their greed and violence, but you decent, honest men devour the earth. So that's one of the final speeches of Lear in Edward Bond's play, Lear, which is quite obviously a King Lear adaptation from the William Shakespeare play. Bond develops this idea called the rational theater, and it's not 100% clear to me from what I'm getting from the introduction in this book. This is Bond Plays 2, and it's not 100% clear from reading Bond's plays how coherent this necessarily is as a philosophy and how distinct it is from other types of theater. So, the central sort of idea of the rational theater seems to be, as far as I can tell, about sort of asking questions and challenging the ways in which people tend to live in the world, particularly challenging sort of middle-class people, people who are comfortable or satisfied with the status quo under capitalism, because Bond is a socialist, at least in the 60s and 70s. I don't know about his long-term politics, but he believed, according to his essay on the rational theater in this book, he believed that the capitalist world that we live in, and I don't necessarily disagree with this, has established socio-cultural norms that are contradictory to the basic functioning of the human being as a psychological animal. And so one of the reasons Bond likes Shakespeare, and he talks about this extensively, is his perspective on Shakespeare is that Shakespeare was someone who continually challenged the norms and ideas of his society. That he pushed spectators, audience members, to think more critically about the world that they live in. And Bond kind of argues that contemporary dramatists, particularly in the theater of the absurd, are in this sort of decadent mode that doesn't promote real questions, but instead satirizes the ways of existing in late industrial capitalism, moving toward the early stages of neoliberalism. What I'm not 100% clear on, and I'm spending a lot of time on the rational theater before I really talk about Lear itself, and I apologize for that. But what I'm not really clear on is how distinct this is from something like Brecht's epic theater, because Brecht's epic theater is similarly meant to, it's rooted in socialist ideas, and it's meant to challenge people to think critically and carefully about the society they live in. I don't know. So, Lear by Bond is an interesting play. It's a cool adaptation of Lear. It's very, very graphic. There's a lot of violence. There's an onstage rape. There is severe inhumanity. And I think all of this is almost rooted in a kind of socialist realist perspective, almost. This idea that you depict reality, but you do so in a way that challenges the sociocultural assumptions of the capitalist worldview while sort of glorifying the possibilities of socialism. Lear, when we start out, is a tyrant. He is a sort of paranoid warlord. He's an old man, but he's a paranoid warlord. We open with um, a construction site where impressed workers are building Lear's wall. And we start actually with an industrial accident, basically. One worker drops a pickaxe, which kills another worker. The workers and the foreman try to cover this up when Lear and his party arrives because they don't want to to get into trouble. Um, Lear nonetheless decides that this is not an accident, but is sabotage on behalf of his enemies. And so he orders this worker shot. He is obsessed with this idea of finishing this wall and creating safety for his kingdom. He says here, I started this wall when I was young. I stopped my enemies in the field, but there were always more of them. How could we ever be free? So I built this wall to keep my enemies out. My people will live behind this wall when I'm dead. You may be governed by fools, but you'll always live in peace. My wall will make you free. That's why the enemies on our borders, the Duke of Cornwall and the Duke of North, try to stop us building it. I won't ask him which he works for. They're both hand in glove. Have him shot. And his two daughters, Fontenelle and Bodice, try to stop him having this worker shot, but not out of any humanitarian values. What we learn is that they are actually on board with the sabotage of the wall because Fontenelle is marrying Cornwall and Bodice is marrying North. So Lear's two daughters are marrying the two people he considers his enemies. They are essentially betraying him in his view. And what we find out is that that view is not entirely unreasonable, because in scene 3, Act 1, scene 3, we get asides from both Fontenelle and Bodice, in which they're basically like, yeah, I married this dude to depose my father and take power. Now my husband is sexually disappointing and a military incompetent, so I'm going to have to basically take command of this situation. And we learn that they've each sent letters to Warrington, who's the Lear's sort of top general, offering that if Warrington betrays Lear and kills him, they will kill their husbands and marry him. So each of the sisters is betraying the other as well. So we learn that they are traitorous. And in fact, when Warrington is subsequently captured, they have his tongue cut out so that he can't tell their husbands about the letters that they had sent him. And then there's this really graphically brutal scene in which they order a soldier to gruesomely beat Warrington. And Fontenelle is just like leaping up and down in glee as this soldier is like kicking Warrington in the head and stomping on his hands and feet to cripple him and like all this stuff. And Fontenelle is like, I want to sit on his lungs. It's this bizarre thing. Like, she wants his lungs pulled out so that she can sit on them. Literally, physically sit on them. And Bodice is just knitting while all this is happening. And then she's basically like, no, we don't kill him. Instead, we're going to just release him into the world, crippled, so that people will see what happens when you side with our father. And the final torture she personally visits on him is that she uses her knitting needles to stab out his eardrum so that he's deafened. It's a brutal scene. I don't know how you stage it convincingly. I mean, there's so much graphic violence there. Like, Stage violence is tricky because often it does not look convincing, and I have a hard time. Like, I can see the putting the knitting needles into the ears. You put the knitting needle there in such a way that, like, just the tip is the tip is just inside your hand, but from the audience it may look like that's being thrust into the ear. So I can see that. I get that one. But the whole, like, the physically maiming him, the physically beating him seems very difficult to stage convincingly. So, Lear is off wandering. He's lost the war. He's now sort of wandering. He comes to the character is listed as boy, but he seems to be an adult. But he's the son of a gravedigger who has become a farmer, and he has a wife, and they live in this small cottage, and the boy invites Lear into their life, but then some soldiers show up. They take Lear, they murder the boy for no good reason, and they rape the pregnant wife, who then loses the baby. Another character called Carpenter, who's the village carpenter, who's in love with the wife, he shows up and it actually ends up killing the three soldiers. Again, it's a brutal, brutal scene. And I think the goal of this, I think the idea of staging this in this way is kind of to demonstrate the real brutality of war. Because this is one of the things, right? This is one of the things about a play like King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear. And we see this also actually with Grigory Kazintsev's 1971 Soviet film version of King Lear. Shakespeare's play treats the conflict between the nobles in King Lear as aristocratic squabbles. But the reality is that the wars that are going on here would devastate large portions of the population. These would be horrific wars impacting a wide swath of society. And that's largely ignored in Shakespeare, partially because of the staging limitations of the early modern stage. But Bond is making that very clear. There's a lot of common people, just everyday soldiers, workers, peasants, etc., who are the victims and perpetrators of graphic violence here. And so I think that's one of the things Bond is really interested in. But he's also interested in the nature of power, right? So there's this one portion, Act 2, Scene 4, at the end here. Fontenelle and Bodice they're running a war against the rebels, led by Cordelia, who's the wife of the boy, right? She's the one who was raped at the end of Act 1, and she's now the leader of the rebellion, along with the carpenter who had killed the soldiers. Cornwall and North, the two husbands of Fontenelle and Bodice, are militarily incompetent. Like, they are losing the war. And so Fontenelle and Bodice basically betray them, have them arrested, and Bodice's idea is that they will be brought out for public occasions when it's necessary. But if they ever do anything to expose this coup, basically, they will be killed. Fontenelle just wants them burned. Fontenelle seems to be the more crudely violent of the two, whereas Bodice is the more cunningly brutal of the two. But she says here, war, power. So everybody else has gone out. So she is soliloquizing here. War, power. I'm forced to sit at this desk, work with my sister, walk beside my husband. They say decide this and that, but I don't decide anything. My decisions are forced on me. I change people's lives and things get done. It's like a mountain moving forward, but not because I tell it to. I started to pull the wall down, but I had to stop that. The men are needed here. She taps the map with the fingertips of one hand. And now I must move them here and here. She moves her index finger on the map. Because the map's my straitjacket, and that's all I can do. I'm trapped. Off, a clock strikes rapidly. Silent, she thinks about life, but not reflectively. She's trying to understand what has happened to her. I hated being a girl, but at least I was happy sometimes. And it was better when I grew up. I could tell myself they didn't humiliate me then. I was almost free. I've made so many plans. One day I'd be my own master. Now I have all the power, and I'm a slave. Worse. So again, this is one of the things that there is this sort of master-slave dialectic element here. The Hegelian idea of the master-slave dialectic is essentially that, paradoxically, the master's position as master depends on the slave to recognize the master. And so the master is, in a way, enslaved to the slave. This is an idea that Bond seems to be very interested in here, that to be the ruler is, in some sense, actually to be ruled, that you do not have decision-making power, that in fact your life is constrained in comparison to someone like the boy who lives on his farm, tends a few pigs, and is basically happy. So again, Bond is taking on these really big issues here, and that's part of what I think he wants to do with the rational theater. I'm just not sure it's as different as all that from something like Brecht's epic theater. And I don't know if Bond would necessarily be all that bothered to be compared to Brecht in this sense.